When an elderly widow visited her late husband's grave to mourn in peace, she never expected her quiet ritual to be interrupted. But one morning, she noticed a young girl leaving letters at the headstone. These letters, filled with heartfelt words, began to reveal a hidden part of her husband's life, a secret he had never shared, even with her. As she uncovers more, each new revelation shakes her understanding of the man she thought she knew. What she discovers next will change her life forever. Before we dive into this emotional journey that uncovers hidden connections and unexpected truths, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Mary Warren moves slowly through the quiet cemetery, each step careful as if the world itself were fragile underfoot. She was 60 now, her life more behind her than ahead, and the years had etched soft lines around her blue-gray eyes. She clutched a modest bouquet of lilies, the blooms fresh and fragrant, their petals a gentle white that echoed the purity of the love she had shared with her late husband, John. She chose lilies because they were his favorite, and every Friday since he'd passed, she came to lay them by his grave. Today, however, felt different, weighted with a strange, restless energy she couldn't quite name. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting a warm golden hue over the cemetery. Shadows stretched long and thin across the carefully maintained lawn, and an autumn breeze stirred the leaves in quiet whispers, filling the air with an earthy scent. Mary pulled her scarf a little tighter around her neck, letting its soft wool warm her skin against the October chill. She liked the solitude of the cemetery at this time of day. It felt like the world had slowed down just for her grief, allowing her a small pocket of time where she could remember and mourn in peace. As she approached John's headstone, her fingers traced its edges as though memorizing its contours could somehow bring her closer to him. The words on the stone were simple: John Warren, beloved husband, 1949 to 2023. The simplicity suited him. He was never a man who wanted attention or fanfare, preferring a life lived quietly away from the limelight. He'd always been more comfortable in the shadows, content to observe, to listen, to be there for those who needed him, without making a spectacle of himself. But it was in those shadows that Mary now felt the unsettling weight of something unfinished. Her mind drifted back to their final days together. John's passing had been sudden, a heart attack in the early hours of the morning that stole him away before she even had a chance to say goodbye. She had woken up to find him gone, his hand still warm in hers, his face peaceful but distant, as if he had already departed to some other realm where she could not follow. That morning had shattered her, leaving her with a gaping wound of unspoken words, unasked questions. Their love had always been one of quiet gestures, a cup of tea brought to her side each morning, the faint scent of cedar lingering from his favorite sweater that she now wore on lonely nights, the comfortable silence they shared. Words had rarely been necessary. But now, standing by his grave, Mary found herself yearning for the words they'd never spoken, for the mysteries of his life that had remained hidden even from her. It was as if his death had opened a door in her heart, revealing a room she had never dared to explore. For the first time, Mary found herself wondering about the man she had loved for over 30 years. Had there been secrets he had kept, parts of himself she had never known? Memories bubbled up, glimpses of him returning home late, his eyes shadowed and distant, or the times he would sit on their porch, looking out into the horizon as though searching for something far beyond their world. He had always been gentle, attentive, but there was a certain guardedness in him, an unspoken promise that he would never let her too close to the parts of himself that were wrapped in silence. The air felt thick with unasked questions, and as Mary knelt by the headstone to place the lilies, a deep ache rose within her. She had thought that time would soften the edges of her grief, that it would become more bearable with each visit. But today the sorrow felt as raw as it had the morning she had lost him, only now it was tinged with the sharp bite of regret and curiosity. Gently she pressed her hand to the earth, imagining that her touch could somehow reach him beneath the ground. "John?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, swallowed up by the vast silence around her. "Did I ever truly know you?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, yet heavy with meaning. She could feel tears welling up, blurring her vision as she recalled the little things he used to do. The way he would hum quietly when he thought no one was listening, the careful way he folded his shirts, the quiet smiles he saved just for her. These memories felt like pieces of a puzzle, yet some parts still felt missing, as though John had left her a riddle she was meant to solve alone. The sun dipped lower, casting an amber glow over the graves, and a chill crept into the air. She closed her eyes, letting the wind caress her face, the coolness mingling with the warmth of the memories that clung to her heart. She could almost hear his voice, soft and steady like the sound of the sea. But even in her mind his words were quiet, slipping away before she could grasp them. Finally she rose, feeling both empty and full, her grief a tangled knot that only tightened with each visit. She didn't know what answers she sought, only that her heart felt incomplete, as though part of John's story remained untold. The world around her was hushed, save for the rustling of the leaves, and Mary was left with a feeling that she was standing on the edge of something she could not yet see. A mystery, perhaps, or a truth that had waited patiently for her all these years. She gave one last, lingering look at the headstone before turning to leave, her fingers grazing the rough edges of the stone as if she could imprint him onto her skin, carry him with her in more than memory alone. As she walked away, the lilies lay at his grave, a small token of her love and sorrow, a symbol of her hope that somehow, through the veil of death, he knew that she would continue to seek him in every corner of her heart. The cemetery was quieter than usual the following Friday when Mary arrived. A thin mist clung to the ground, giving the gravestones a ghostly appearance, and the air felt damp, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Mary's footsteps echoed softly on the stone path, each step slow and deliberate. She carried her usual bouquet of lilies, their fresh scent filling her senses, grounding her in the familiarity of this weekly ritual. Yet, even as she moved with her usual purpose, a strange feeling lingered in her chest. Her curiosity about John's past had only grown since her last visit, and although she hadn't spoken about it to anyone, the question seemed to swell in her mind, pressing against the boundaries of her heart. As she approached John's grave, however, Mary noticed something unusual. A small figure, a girl, perhaps no more than 9 or 10, was crouched by the headstone, her hands busy with something Mary couldn't quite see. The child had soft, dark curls that fell over her shoulders, and she wore a simple red dress that stood out brightly against the grayness of the cemetery. Mary froze, watching the girl with a mix of surprise and curiosity. She couldn't imagine why a child would be here, let alone visiting John's grave. The girl was placing a small folded letter near the base of the headstone, her expression solemn and focused. For a moment, Mary wondered if she was some distant relative she'd never met, perhaps the child of one of John's long-lost friends. But then, as if sensing Mary's presence, the girl looked up, her wide, dark eyes meeting Mary's with a startled expression. "Hello there," Mary said gently, trying not to frighten her. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the letter the girl had just placed. The girl's eyes flickered to the letter, then back to Mary. She hesitated, biting her lower lip as if debating whether to speak. But before Mary could ask anything more, the girl suddenly turned and darted off down the path, her small figure disappearing quickly among the gravestones. Mary stood in stunned silence, her heart pounding with a strange urgency she didn't fully understand. Once the girl was out of sight, Mary approached the headstone and knelt down, her fingers brushing against the letter. It was a simple piece of paper, folded carefully, with her husband's name, John Warren, written neatly across the front in a child's handwriting. She hesitated, unsure if she should open it, but her curiosity soon got the better of her. Gently, Mary unfolded the letter. The writing inside was simple yet heartfelt. Dear Mr. John, thank you for helping me and my family when we needed it most. I will never forget your kindness. I wish I could have seen you again. Love, Emily. The words struck Mary like a physical blow, and she felt a tremor run through her hands as she read them again. Emily. The girl's name was Emily. She tried to remember if John had ever mentioned helping a young girl or her family, but nothing came to mind. His quiet acts of kindness were no surprise to her. John had always been a gentle soul who never sought recognition for the things he did. But this was something she hadn't known about, a kindness extended beyond her sight, hidden in the folds of his life like so many other secrets. A wave of emotion swept over her, a mixture of pride, confusion, and a strange ache that only deepened her longing for him. She wondered what kind of help John had offered to Emily's family, what need had drawn him to their lives. Had it been money, shelter, a meal shared with strangers? The letter gave her no clues, only a name, a small beacon that illuminated another shadowed corner of John's life. Mary folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the grave, feeling as if she were handling a sacred object. She traced her fingers over John's name on the headstone, her mind filled with questions that had no easy answers. "Who were you, John?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the misty air. The wind seemed to carry her words away, as if the cemetery itself were keeping its secrets. Leaving the letter in its place, she rose slowly, casting one last glance at the path where Emily had disappeared. She couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this brief, mysterious meeting, was more than just chance. It was as if John, even in death, was trying to communicate with her, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led to the parts of him she had never known. With a heavy heart, she turned to leave, the weight of her questions pressing down on her shoulders. She felt an almost unbearable longing to understand the depth of the man she had loved, the hidden facets of his soul that had touched the lives of others in ways she could only begin to imagine. As she walked away, the cemetery grew quiet once more, and Mary couldn't help but feel that the shadows around her were closing in, holding secrets she was now determined to uncover. The following Friday, Mary approached the cemetery with a new sense of anticipation. Her weekly visits to John's grave had become routine, a quiet ritual that brought her a small sense of peace amidst her grief. But today, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, a spark of curiosity, a purpose beyond sorrow. As she neared John's headstone, her heart quickened. She found herself hoping, almost irrationally, that the girl, Emily, might be there again. She wanted to know more about this child and the connection she had shared with John. She yearned for answers that might help piece together the puzzle of her husband's secret kindnesses, the parts of him he had kept hidden even from her. But the cemetery was empty. The misty quietness felt heavier than usual, as if the grounds themselves knew her longing and were keeping their secrets sealed. She sighed, feeling a flicker of disappointment, and approached John's grave, noting the familiar headstone and the flowers she'd left behind, now wilted but still carrying the faintest hint of fragrance. Then her heart skipped. There, lying just where she had placed her lilies, was another letter, neatly folded and addressed in the same careful handwriting as before. Mr. John. Mary knelt, hands trembling, as she picked up the letter. Her breath caught as she unfolded it, eyes scanning the page with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Dear Mr. John, I wanted to come see you, but it feels different now that you're not here. I miss you so much. Thank you for being there when everything felt wrong. You were like a hero to me and my family. Love, Emily. The words struck a chord deep within her, each line brimming with emotion. Emily's gratitude was palpable, radiating from the simple words on the page, as though the young girl's heart had been poured out on paper. Mary closed her eyes, letting the words settle within her. The mystery of John's hidden kindnesses had deepened, and with it her resolve to understand him more fully. Mary found herself wondering about the struggles Emily had mentioned. What had happened to her family that John had stepped in to help? And why had he kept it from her? These questions gnawed at her, the ache of not knowing mingling with her love and pride for the man she had lost. She pictured John's warm, steady eyes, his gentle hands that had always been ready to help without a word or expectation of thanks. It was just like him to keep this part of his life hidden, even from her, sparing her any worry while he offered his silent support to someone in need. But this time, the desire for answers outweighed her respect for his quiet humility. She felt a growing need to find Emily, to understand the connection between her husband and this child. If John had left a legacy of kindness, she wanted to know it, to hold on to it as another memory to carry forward in his absence. That afternoon, Mary left the cemetery with a determined heart. She walked home, the cool October air filling her lungs, a plan already forming in her mind. She would return tomorrow, earlier in the day, and wait near John's grave. If Emily returned with another letter, Mary would have the chance to speak with her, to ask the questions that now filled her mind. That night, sleep eluded at her. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying memories of her life with John, searching for any hint, any fragment that might explain this hidden part of him. She remembered little things, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt heavy with unspoken meaning. There were the nights he'd come home late, tired but content, brushing off her questions with a gentle smile and a kiss on her forehead. There were days he'd quietly slip away, saying he had an errand to run, but returning with nothing more than a warm embrace and an unspoken peace in his eyes. Had she missed signs, clues that he was involved in something beyond their shared life? She wondered if he had worried about how she might feel if she knew of his quiet acts of service, his willingness to help others even if it meant keeping secrets from her. The thought brought a bittersweet smile to her lips. John had always been thoughtful, considerate, the kind of man who cared more about others than himself. The next morning, Mary returned to the cemetery, her heart racing as she made her way through the mist-covered grounds. She arrived early, finding a bench close enough to John's grave that she could watch without intruding. She sat, her eyes fixed on the pathway, waiting with a patience fueled by the need for answers. Minutes ticked by, stretching into an hour, and then, finally, she saw a small figure in a red coat, walking toward John's grave. It was Emily. The child's steps were slow, her gaze downcast as she approached, clutching another small letter in her hand. Mary rose and approached gently, not wanting to frighten her. Emily looked up, startled, but Mary smiled softly, hoping to convey kindness and understanding. "Hello, Emily," she said, her voice warm but tentative. "I hope I didn't scare you." The girl looked at her for a long moment, her dark eyes filled with something between curiosity and apprehension. She held the letter close to her chest, as though protecting a precious secret. I'm Mary," she said softly. "John's wife. I saw the letters you left for him." Emily's expression softened and she nodded slowly, her small fingers fidgeting with the edges of the paper. "You knew him?" Mary asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded again, her gaze dropping to the ground. He was very kind to us," Emily murmured, her voice tinged with the innocence and honesty of childhood. "He helped us when we needed it the most. I just wanted to say thank you." Mary felt her throat tighten, emotions swirling within her. She crouched down to Emily's level, looking into the girl's eyes with a gentle intensity. "Would you mind telling me about it?" she asked, her voice both tender and pleading. "About how he helped you?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the letter she held before looking back at Mary. She bit her lip, then gave a small nod. "There was a time when my mom was sick," Emily began, her voice soft and unsure. "We didn't have enough money for medicine. Mr. John came by our house one day. I don't know how he knew, but he did. He brought groceries and even paid for the medicine. He didn't want anyone to know. He just said that sometimes people need a friend." Tears pricked Mary's eyes and she pressed a hand to her mouth, her heart swelling with a mix of pride, sadness, and a deep, aching love for the man she had shared her life with. She could almost picture him standing on Emily's doorstep, his warm smile easing the worries of a frightened child and her sick mother. John had always had a way of knowing when people were hurting, and he had done so much to ease their burdens without ever seeking recognition. Emily's story lingered in the air, a testament to the man John had been. Mary reached out, gently touching the girl's shoulder. "Thank you for telling me, Emily. It means the world to know he was there for you." The girl smiled shyly, a light returning to her eyes. "He was a good man," she whispered. Mary nodded, her own heart lighter yet weighed with the knowledge of the kindness her husband had sown, a legacy she now felt responsible to continue. As they stood together by John's grave, a sense of peace settled over Mary. She knew now that John's kindness was a gift he had given not only to Emily's family, but to her as well. A gift of purpose, a reason to carry his legacy forward. The following Sunday, Mary found herself standing outside an old brick apartment building on the edge of town, her heart pounding as she looked up at the windows. She had spent her morning gathering her courage, repeating to herself the reasons she needed to see Emily and her family once more. John had been an important part of their lives, and she wanted to understand how deep that connection ran. More than that, she wanted to do something, to help in whatever way she could, to step into the role John had so quietly filled. Taking a deep breath, she clutched the small gift basket she had prepared, filled with fresh fruit, warm bread, and a few essentials she thought might be useful, and climbed the narrow staircase to Emily's apartment. She found herself pausing just outside the door, her fingers hovering above the brass knocker. A thousand doubts flooded her mind, but then, in a moment of resolve, she knocked softly. The door opened slowly, and there stood Emily, her dark curls framing her curious, cautious eyes. The girl blinked, surprise flickering across her face as she recognized Mary standing there. "Hello, Emily," Mary said, a gentle smile on her face. "I hope I'm not intruding." Emily glanced back into the apartment before looking up at Mary, and after a brief hesitation, she nodded and opened the door wider. "Mom?" she called out softly, her voice carrying into the dimly lit room behind her. "There's someone here to see you." A moment later, a woman appeared in the doorway, her expression weary but kind. She looked to be in her late 30s, with the same dark curls as Emily, though hers were streaked with gray. Her face softened as she saw Mary, and she offered a tentative smile. "Mrs. Warren?" she asked, her voice gentle. Mary nodded. "Please, call me Mary. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to come by and say hello, and to see if there's anything I could do for you." Emily's mother's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she seemed lost for words. "You're very kind, Mary. I'm Helen, and, well, please, come in." She gestured toward a small but cozy living room where a worn but comfortable-looking couch awaited. Mary entered, taking in the modest furnishings, the signs of a home that had seen struggle yet held warmth in every corner. Once they were all seated, Helen looked at Mary with a blend of gratitude and curiosity. "Emily told me that you came to the cemetery. I was so surprised to hear it. We didn't expect anyone to know." Mary smiled gently. "I didn't know about any of this until recently. John, he never told me. But meeting Emily, reading her letters, I needed to know more. He meant a great deal to her, didn't he?" Helen's eyes softened, a faraway look settling over her face. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the window. "John was one of the kindest people I've ever met," she said, her voice soft with emotion. "I'll never forget the day he came to our door. We were struggling, really struggling, and I had nowhere to turn. It was as though he knew, somehow, just how much we needed help. She paused, taking a steadying breath. He showed up with bags of groceries, medicine, things we couldn't afford. He never made a fuss about it, never asked for anything in return. He just quietly helped us, and Emily adored him. He always made her laugh, made her feel seen. Emily, who had been sitting quietly beside her mother, looked up at Mary with a shy but warm smile. "He told me I was brave," she said softly. "He said it was brave to keep going, even when things were hard." Mary felt a lump rise in her throat, her emotions swelling as she listened. She could almost picture John standing in their doorway, his gentle presence filling their home with a warmth they so desperately needed. Her heart ached with a mixture of pride and sorrow, knowing that he had carried out these acts of kindness without ever speaking a word about them. "He was a quiet man," Mary said, her voice choked with emotion. "He never wanted attention for the things he did. I think he felt that helping others was, well, something to be done humbly." Helen nodded, her expression somber. "He never asked for anything in return, not even a thank you. He just cared. He would come by every now and then, just to check on us. He'd leave a little envelope now and then with some money, or bring over a warm meal. He gave us hope when we had so little of it." As Mary listened, her heart swelled with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. The grief that had weighed her down since John's passing seemed to shift, replaced by a new sense of responsibility. She could see now that John's legacy wasn't just in memories or belongings. It was in the kindness he had shared, the lives he had quietly touched. And as his wife, she felt a calling to carry that kindness forward. "I want to help you if you'll let me," Mary said, reaching out to place a hand gently over Helen's. "John may be gone, but I feel that part of him lives on in all of us, especially in the kindness he showed you. I'd like to be here for you as he was." Helen's eyes filled with tears and she gripped Mary's hand tightly. "Thank you, Mary. That means more to us than you could ever know." Emily, watching the two women, nodded quietly, her small smile filled with gratitude. It was as though an unspoken promise had been made between them, a bond forged through John's memory, one that connected them in ways beyond mere friendship or charity. As they sat together, sharing stories of John, the room seemed to brighten, a warmth filling the air that chased away the shadows of hardship. They laughed at memories of his gentle humor, his small acts of kindness, the way he had brought joy into their lives with such quiet dignity. And for the first time since his passing, Mary felt a sense of peace, a feeling that her grief, though still raw, had found a purpose. When she finally rose to leave, Mary felt lighter, as though some of the weight of her sorrow had been lifted. She promised to return soon, to check in on them, to continue the connection John had started. Emily and Helen walked her to the door, their gratitude evident in their warm smiles and the gentle hugs they shared. Outside, the autumn sun was setting, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. As Mary walked home, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet strength that steadied her steps. She knew that her journey of grief and healing had only just begun, but she also knew she was not alone. She had a new family now, a bond forged through the memory of a man whose life had been one of simple, profound kindness. And in that moment she felt closer to John than ever, as though his spirit walked beside her, proud and grateful for the legacy of love and compassion she had chosen to carry forward. Mary awoke that morning with a renewed sense of purpose. For so long her days had felt like they blurred into each other, a quiet stream of routines and reminders of John's absence. Yet now, every morning carried with it the same small flicker of warmth, a reason to get up, to move forward. It was a warmth she hadn't felt in months, one that seemed to flow directly from the kindness John had left behind. The quiet apartment where she lived now felt somehow fuller. Since that first afternoon with Helen and Emily, she'd begun to envision small ways to fill their lives, to support them in ways that would continue what John had started. She wanted each visit to feel meaningful, to show that she was not merely passing time or paying a debt, but rather honoring the deep connection that John had forged with this family. As she prepared a basket with essentials for today's visit, her thoughts wandered to the conversation she'd had with Helen, those late afternoons in the small kitchen where they'd shared tea and laughter. With every story Helen told, Mary felt like she was uncovering a new piece of John's spirit, seeing the man she loved through the eyes of those he had touched so deeply. His acts of kindness had rippled outwards, changing lives in ways she hadn't even imagined. And it was now Mary's privilege, her calling, to carry that legacy forward. When she arrived at Helen and Emily's modest apartment, the warm, homey scent of freshly baked bread greeted her. Helen had begun baking more often, a skill she had learned from her grandmother, but rarely had the time or means to indulge. Now, with Mary's help, Helen felt freer to create small comforts for her daughter, to fill their home with scents and flavors that felt like love made tangible. Mary stepped into the kitchen, setting her basket on the table as Helen looked up with a welcoming smile. "You're always bringing us something?" Helen remarked with a playful tone, though her eyes shone with gratitude. "Well, I can't help it," Mary replied with a laugh, untying the cloth around the basket to reveal fresh fruit, warm bread, and a few winter coats for Helen and Emily. "It's getting colder, and I want to make sure you're both bundled up." Helen's gaze softened as she took in the small yet thoughtful gifts. She knew that for Mary, these gestures went beyond charity. They were acts of love, expressions of the bond that had grown between them. She placed a hand over Mary's, squeezing it gently. "John was a lucky man, you know. You're every bit as kind as he was." Mary's smile faltered for a moment, overcome by the familiar ache of missing him. But it was a gentler ache now, softened by purpose and pride. "Thank you, Helen," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He always wanted to do good, and now, well, it feels right to be here with you to carry on what he started." As they settled around the kitchen table, Emily emerged from her room, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Mary. She had grown close to her in a short span of time, finding in her a surrogate grandmother, a source of comfort and joy in the otherwise quiet rhythm of her days. "Mary!" Emily exclaimed, her voice full of warmth. She hurried over, wrapping her arms around Mary in a hug that felt both spontaneous and deeply sincere. Mary hugged her back, feeling the small, solid weight of Emily's affection grounding her. She reached into her basket, pulling out a neatly wrapped bundle. "I brought you something special, Emily," she said, handing it to her. Emily's eyes widened as she carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook. Her fingers ran over the smooth cover, and a shy but delighted smile broke across her face. "Thank you, Mary," she whispered, her eyes bright with excitement. "I love to draw." Mary's heart swelled as she watched Emily's excitement. It was such a simple gift, but she knew how much it would mean to the girl. Emily had once confided to her that art was her way of making sense of the world, a way to express things she couldn't put into words. "That's exactly why I got them for you," Mary said softly. "I'd love to see what you create." Emily beamed, hugging the sketchbook to her chest before slipping away to the corner of the kitchen, where she immediately began sketching, her brow furrowed in concentration. Watching her, Mary felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that she was helping to nurture the same hope and resilience John had instilled in them. Over the next few hours, Mary and Helen talked quietly, sharing stories and memories. Helen told her more about the first time John had arrived at their doorstep, about the relief she had felt when she saw him standing there with groceries in his hands, his smile reassuring and gentle. "I don't think I'll ever forget that day," Helen murmured, her voice thick with gratitude. It was like a guardian angel had appeared. Mary listened, feeling a bittersweet pride swell within her. She could almost see John in that moment, standing there with his quiet strength, his presence offering comfort to a family in need. It was as if Through these stories, she was able to know him in a new way, to deepen her love for the man he had been. As the afternoon drew to a close, Helen excused herself to tend to a few chores, leaving Mary alone with Emily. The young girl was deeply engrossed in her sketching, her small fingers moving deftly over the paper. Mary watched her for a while, mesmerized by the way Emily's eyes sparkled with concentration and joy. After a moment, Mary leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Emily," she said softly, "I wanted to ask if you'd like to come with me somewhere special this weekend." Emily looked up, her face curious. "Where?" Mary smiled. "To visit John's grave. I think he would like it if we brought him some flowers together." Emily's face lit up and she nodded eagerly. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice warm with affection. The next morning, they walked hand in hand through the cemetery, a light frost covering the ground, making it shimmer in the early winter sun. Emily held a small bouquet of daisies, her fingers curled tightly around the stems, her expression solemn yet peaceful. As they arrived at John's grave, Mary took a deep breath, feeling the familiar ache in her chest, but this time it was softer, mingled with a sense of gratitude. She watched as Emily knelt beside the grave, placing the flowers gently at its base. "Thank you, Mr. John," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible, "for everything." Mary's heart swelled, tears pricking her eyes as she knelt beside Emily. She placed a hand on the cold marble, closing her eyes and letting herself feel John's presence, the quiet strength that had carried them all. "I think he hears you, Emily," she murmured softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "And I think he's proud of you." They stayed there in silence, two figures bound by a shared love and the memory of a man whose kindness had bridged the gaps between their lives. Mary felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her, a realization that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what John would have wanted. As they walked back to the car, Emily slipped her hand into Mary's, her fingers warm and small against Mary's own. "Will you keep visiting us, Mary?" she asked, her voice tinged with a quiet hope. Mary looked down, her heart brimming with affection. "Always, sweetheart," she promised. "I'm part of your family now, just as John would have wanted." And as they drove away, Mary felt a deep, abiding sense of purpose settle within her. She knew her life would never be the same, but she also knew that this new path, this commitment to honoring John's legacy, had given her a reason to keep moving forward. She would carry his kindness with her, sharing it with those who needed it most, and in doing so, she would keep him alive in the world, a quiet flame of love and compassion that would never fade. Winter settled over the town with a quiet intensity, blanketing the streets and rooftops in layers of glistening snow. Each morning, Mary would wake to find her small garden covered in frost, the barren branches of the trees sparkling in the early light. But this winter felt different. Instead of the cold bringing with it a sense of emptiness, Mary found comfort in its stillness. The quietness, she realized, was no longer a reminder of her loneliness. It had become a space for memories, a sanctuary where she could feel John's presence in the simplest of things. A snowflake caught on her glove, a gust of wind that felt like his gentle touch. Every week she would visit Helen and Emily, bringing along little things she thought might brighten their day: a loaf of homemade bread, a basket of winter apples, a warm scarf she had knitted by hand. And in return, they had become a family to her. They shared laughter, warmth, and stories, weaving a bond that filled the once empty corners of her life. For the first time since John's passing, Mary felt as though her days had taken on a renewed purpose, guided by the quiet, persistent love that John had left behind. One morning, Mary decided it was time to invite Helen and Emily to her home. She wanted them to see the place she had shared with John, the space where so much of her life had unfolded. She spent the morning preparing, dusting the shelves, rearranging photos, and placing flowers throughout the rooms to add warmth to the cold winter air. She even baked a small batch of John's favorite scones, their buttery aroma filling the house and bringing with it a flood of cherished memories. When Helen and Emily arrived, Mary greeted them at the door, her face alight with joy. She wrapped them in warm hugs, her heart swelling with gratitude as she welcomed them into her home. For Mary, this wasn't just a visit. It was an invitation into her past, a way of sharing John's life with the people he had cared for so deeply. They wandered through the house, taking in the photos and small tokens of a life well lived. Mary watched as Emily's eyes lingered on the framed pictures of John, her fingers tracing the edges of the frames with reverence. In every room there were traces of him, a worn book on the shelf, a sweater hanging on the back of a chair, a collection of seashells they had gathered on their last beach trip together. This was his favorite room, Mary said as they entered John's study, a cozy space filled with books and mementos from their travels. He could spend hours in here, reading or working on his little projects. He was always a curious man, always learning something new. Emily's eyes sparkled as she looked around, taking in the shelves filled with books and trinkets. She ran her fingers along the spines, her expression filled with wonder. "I can see why he liked it here," she said softly. "It feels peaceful." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He was a peaceful man. He believed in kindness, in helping others without asking for anything in return. That's why he helped you and your mother. He saw people who needed a friend, and he wanted to be that friend. They spent hours sharing stories, laughter filling the house as they spoke of John, each memory a thread weaving them closer together. Helen shared her memories of John's quiet visits, his comforting presence that had lifted her spirits during the darkest of times. Emily, too, shared small anecdotes, moments when John had made her laugh, the way he would listen to her as though her words mattered, even when the world felt heavy. In the afternoon, they gathered in the living room, where Mary had set out a small photo album on the coffee table. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn pages, revealing pictures of John and herself from years past. Images of beach trips, holiday dinners, quiet evenings spent reading by the fire. Emily gazed at the photos with wide eyes, her small hands gently tracing the images as though trying to feel the warmth of the moments captured within. She looked up at Mary, a shy smile on her face. "He looks so happy," she whispered. "You both do." Mary felt a lump rise in her throat, her eyes misting with tears. "We were, Emily. We were very happy. And knowing that he was able to share some of that happiness with you and your mother, it brings me peace." Helen placed a hand over Mary's, squeezing it softly. "He changed our lives, Mary. I'll never be able to express how much his kindness meant to us. And now, having you here, being part of our family, it's more than we could have ever asked for." The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the weight of gratitude and love filling the room. It was a moment of quiet reflection, of shared understanding, and Mary felt as though John were with them, his gentle spirit present in the warmth that surrounded them. As evening approached, Helen and Emily prepared to leave, thanking Mary for the afternoon and the memories they had shared. But before they left, Emily hesitated, glancing back at Mary with a shy expression. "Mary, would it be all right if we visited John's grave together sometime?" she asked, her voice filled with a gentle longing. Mary's heart swelled with emotion, and she nodded, her voice choked with warmth. "I would like that very much, Emily. I think John would be happy to know we were all there together." A few days later, they made their way to the cemetery, wrapped in warm coats and scarves against the crisp winter air. The snow lay thick on the ground, sparkling in the morning sunlight, and the silence of the cemetery was broken only by the crunch of their footsteps. Emily carried a small bouquet of daisies, her fingers clutching the stems tightly as though holding on to something precious. As they reached John's grave, she knelt down, carefully placing the flowers at the foot of the headstone. Her face was solemn, her expression filled with a quiet reverence. "Thank you, Mr. John," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything you did for us. I won't forget you." Mary knelt beside her, her hand resting gently on Emily's shoulder. Her heart felt full, both with sorrow and with pride, knowing that John's kindness had left an indelible mark on this young girl's life. She placed her own hand on the headstone, feeling the cold stone beneath her fingers, and closed her eyes. "John," she murmured softly, "I wish you could see us now. You brought us together, and I promise to carry on what you started." They stayed there for a while, lost in their thoughts, sharing a moment of quiet connection. Mary felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath her. She could almost feel John's presence, his quiet strength enfolding them, his love binding them together in a way that transcended time and distance. As they finally rose to leave, Mary looked down at Emily, who reached up to take her hand. They walked away from the grave, their footsteps side by side, leaving a trail in the snow, a testament to the legacy of kindness and love that John had left behind. For Mary, this visit marked a turning point. She knew that her life would always carry the ache of John's absence, but it was no longer a burden. It was a reminder of the love they had shared, a love that had grown even after his passing, reaching beyond her own heart to touch the lives of those around her. As they returned to the warmth of Helen's apartment, Mary felt lighter, her heart filled with a sense of renewal. She realized that she was no longer defined by her grief. She was defined by the legacy she had chosen to carry forward. John's kindness, his quiet acts of compassion, had become her own mission, a way to honor his memory and keep his spirit alive in the world. That night, as Mary sat alone in her living room, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over her. She looked at the small, framed photo of John on the mantel, his gentle smile a reminder of all that he had been to her and all that he continued to be. "Thank you, John," she whispered into the quiet room, "for everything." With that, she knew she was ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that John's love would guide her, just as it had guided her to Helen and Emily. She was no longer alone. She was surrounded by a family bound by love, resilience, and the legacy of a man who had believed in the power of quiet kindness. And as the snow fell softly outside, blanketing the town in a peaceful hush, Mary felt her heart bloom with hope, a gentle flame that would carry her forward one step at a time.